Joe Labelle trudged through the deep snow, his rifle slung over his shoulder. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, and every footstep seemed to echo in the empty landscape. He had been to Angikuni Lake many times, but something about today felt wrong. The wind had stopped, and the world seemed to hold its breath. As he reached the top of the hill, he spotted the village below, silent and untouched in the far distance. Upon reaching the village, Joe immediately noticed the eerie quiet. No children played. No animals stirred. The huts were abandoned, their doors wide open, and the smoke from the fire had long since disappeared. It was a village frozen in time, but no one was there. He stood frozen, unsure of whether to call out or remain silent, but deep down he knew. The village was empty, and something wasn't right. Inside one of the huts, Joe found bowls of food still sitting on the table, frozen solid in the cold. A stew left half-eaten, a loaf of bread half-sliced. The scene was as if the villagers had just vanished in the middle of their day-to-day lives. He walked further into the room, his breath shallow and fast. Why would they leave so suddenly, without even finishing their meals? Joe stepped outside and surveyed the snow around him, hoping to find some kind of clue. There were no footprints leading away from the village, no sign of anyone fleeing. The snow was perfectly undisturbed, as if no one had walked across it for days. His breath caught in his throat. How could the villagers have vanished without a trace? In the village graveyard, Joe's stomach lurched. The freshly dug graves lay open, the earth disturbed, but there were no bodies. It was as though the dead had been pulled from their graves, taken. The wind picked up, a howl of sound that rattled the trees. He quickly turned, unable to escape the haunting idea that the dead, like the living, had vanished without a trace. Near one of the huts, Joe found a fully loaded rifle lying untouched in the snow. Its muzzle was aimed toward the ground, and its stock was covered in frost. No one in their right mind would leave their only means of defense in such an exposed position. The rifle had been there too long. It was as if someone had dropped it and walked away, never to return. Walking further toward the outskirts of the village, Joe's heart sank. He found sled dogs frozen solid in the snow, their leashes still attached to the posts where they had been left. Their eyes were wide open, staring into nothingness, and their bodies were stiff with the cold. They had been left to die. The air grew thicker, and Joe suddenly felt the weight of something watching him. Joe set a flare into the air, watching it streak through the dark sky. He had to get help, and fast. He built a fire near the lake, trying to warm himself against the cold that seemed to creep into his bones. As the flare faded into the night, he thought he saw a flicker of light in the distance. Was someone else out here? Or was it just his mind playing tricks? As Joe sat by the fire, the wind began to pick up. At first, he thought it was just the storm, but then he heard it. A whisper, faint and unintelligible, carried on the breeze. He couldn't tell where it came from, but it was close. Too close. His heart raced as he stood up, clutching his rifle, but there was nothing there. He was alone. Or was he? Just as Joe began to lose hope, Sergeant Alan Crawford and his team arrived on horseback, their boots crunching through the snow. The moment they stepped into the village, the atmosphere shifted. The silence deepened. Crawford surveyed the abandoned village, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Where is everyone?" he muttered, but his voice carried no answer. There was no sound, only the wind and the weight of an invisible presence. The RCMP began to investigate the huts, but they found nothing. No signs of struggle, no evidence of forced entry. Everything was undisturbed, except for the missing villagers. Crawford frowned, feeling that all was not as it seemed. "They didn't leave on their own," he murmured, his eyes scanning the village. The houses stood empty, like tombs waiting for their inhabitants to return. The sled dogs lay as they had been left, frozen in place by the cold. One of the officers tried to examine them, but the dogs' bodies were stiff as boards. Their fur had been matted by ice, and their eyes were glassy and unseeing. No sign of life remained in them. Crawford could feel something cold seep into his bones, an unsettling presence that lingered in the air. In the main hut, Crawford's men found a carving on the wall, unlike anything they'd seen before. Strange symbols were etched into the wood, depicting figures with exaggerated features and unsettling postures. "What does this mean?" one officer asked. Natar, the Inuit elder, took a step forward, his face pale. "They are not human," he whispered, his voice shaking. Elder Natar sat with Crawford and Joe, recounting an old Inuit legend, the people of the ice, who lived beneath the frozen lake. He spoke of strange lights in the sky, and how every few generations they would rise to claim the souls of the living. Crawford's skepticism faltered. Natar's tale was more than just a myth. It felt too real, too close to what they had already witnessed. Crawford radioed for backup, but the signal kept cutting in and out. The transmission was filled with strange static that seemed almost deliberate. At times, Crawford swore he heard voices on the other end, speaking a language he couldn't understand. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the signal would die, only to return, more distorted than before. As night fell, a light flickered on the horizon. It was faint, but it was there. A strange, glowing orb hanging in the sky. Crawford and Joe stared at it in disbelief. The light moved slowly, then began to shift shapes, twisting into symbols that made no sense. Joe stepped back. "What is that?" he asked, his voice thick with fear. The ground beneath their feet began to tremble. The ice on the lake cracked loudly, sending echoes through the valley. The team gathered around, trying to make sense of the noise. Suddenly, the crack widened, and the ice shifted as if something was moving beneath it. Something massive. Crawford's heart pounded. Whatever was under the ice, it wasn't meant to be disturbed. From the corner of his eye, Joe caught a glimpse of movement near the edge of the lake. He turned quickly, but there was nothing there. He squinted, trying to make sense of the shadow, but it had vanished, or never existed at all. He grabbed Crawford's arm. "Did you see that?" But Crawford only shook his head. "You're seeing things," he said. But Joe wasn't sure. Later that night, the team gathered around a campfire. As they spoke, they began to hear soft, distant whispers carried by the wind. It wasn't the sound of human voices. It was something else. Crawford gripped his rifle, his nerves stretched tight. "Stay alert," he ordered. But no one could explain where the whispers were coming from, or who was speaking. In the final hut, Joe uncovered a journal, the last testament of the village's survivors. Its pages were frantic, scribbled with lines like, "The lights have come. They've taken us all. The lake calls to them, to the people below." Joe read the last page aloud, and his voice trembled. "They're coming for us next." The journal's last entry confirmed Joe's worst fears. The villagers had been taken by the entities beneath the lake. The lights in the sky were a signal, and the village had been a sacrifice. Crawford stared at the journal, his mind racing. This wasn't a simple disappearance. This was something far older. That night, the lights returned. Brighter, more intense. They hovered above the lake, shifting in strange patterns, like a beacon calling them closer. Crawford felt a deep, primal fear grip his chest. They had come back for them. The ice beneath them groaned again. Something stirred beneath the frozen surface, something ancient and immense. Joe could feel the ground trembling, his legs unsteady as the ice cracked wider. He turned to Crawford, his face pale. "We have to leave. Now." A shadow darted across the lake, too fast to be a person. It was tall, moving like a figure made of smoke. Joe reached for his rifle, but before he could raise it, the shadow was gone. The lights hovered closer, like a predator closing in on its prey. Crawford shouted for the team to gather their gear, but before they could even move, the ice beneath their feet cracked wide open. The ground started to break apart as the lights above began to circle. They weren't just shining. They were pulling the very earth apart. There was no escape. The ground beneath their feet cracked wide open, the ice giving way like brittle paper. The team scattered, racing toward the last remaining sled. The air around them grew thick with something unnatural. They could hear it now, the low hum of the lights above, drawing them closer. Their panic grew as their escape route seemed to disappear into the growing dark. Behind them, the village started to fade into the night, its form flickering like a mirage. 1 minute, it stood clear and visible. The next, it was gone. Had the village ever existed at all? Or had it been swallowed by the lake's mysterious force? Crawford shouted for everyone to keep moving, but the strange pull of the light was stronger than ever. As they ran, Crawford spotted a figure in the distance. At first, it appeared to be one of his men, but then it moved too fluidly, like a shadow on the ice. It wasn't human. It stood still, watching them, its eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. As they drew closer, it disappeared into the lake's mist. The ice began to shift again beneath their feet. The cracks widened, and the cold seeped deeper. Crawford turned to Joe, breathless. "We need to move faster." Something was pulling at their very souls, urging them to stop running and look behind. But they dared not turn. Something was following them. Crawford tried the radio once more, but it crackled with static. Then, just for a brief second, a familiar voice appeared on the other end. "You should have left," it whispered. "They've already marked you." The signal cut off, and a heavy silence filled the air. The light grew brighter. They were being drawn closer. They finally reached their sled. But the village, it was back. Just like before, the huts were standing, as if time had reversed itself. The villagers, or what had once been them, now appeared at the doorways, their faces hollow, eyes glowing with an eerie light. They were waiting for something. As they attempted to flee, the lake cracked wide open beneath their sled. The ground split in two, sending them tumbling into the icy waters. The ice formed a thick barrier, trapping them as the lights above intensified, casting long, horrible shadows. They could see the shadowy figures emerging from the lake, walking toward them. The villagers, no longer human, stood at the edge of the lake, watching, waiting. Their eyes were filled with an ancient knowledge, and their movements were slow, deliberate. They had been here before. Joe and Crawford could only stand frozen as the shadows grew larger, taking form and moving toward them. The lake was alive, its waters beckoning. Suddenly Joe saw something, a vision of the villagers' last moments. The strange lights above them, the coldness consuming them, and then the village, taken into the lake's grasp. The ice was the barrier, and now it was the prison. They had been pulled under the lake, swallowed whole. And now it was their turn. The force pulling at them grew unbearable. Joe stumbled, feeling something press against his chest. A heavy presence in the air made his body freeze in place. He couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as if the very atmosphere around him was thick with an unseen hand. He reached for his rifle, but it was already too late. The ice cracked around them. The lights above grew brighter still, now a storm of energy that seemed to pierce the sky. Shifting shapes, they circled above the lake, growing larger and more intense with each passing second. They weren't just lights. They were calling something from below. The lake was alive, its depths now awakening. The darkness swallowed them whole. A sense of hopelessness pressed in on all sides, and the world around them began to stretch and contort. The ice beneath them no longer held its form, and Joe felt as though he was falling through time and space. The ice, the village, and the land around them all faded, leaving only the cold void of the lake. As they were pulled deeper, Joe saw something. Figures moving beneath the ice. They were not human, but something far older, ancient beings that existed below the frozen surface. Their faces were pale, eyes empty, and filled with an otherworldly hunger. They were the ones who had vanished, and now they had returned. Joe fought with every ounce of strength he had, but it was no use. The cold consumed him, draining the life from his limbs as the unseen force wrapped around him like chains. His vision blurred, his breath ragged. He looked toward Crawford, but his partner too was frozen in place, unable to move as the figures closed in. They were trapped. There was no escape. As the lake's grip tightened around them, Joe caught one final glimpse of the strange, shifting lights above. They were no longer distant. They were right above them, shining down with an unearthly intensity. A final burst of light blinded him, and everything went dark. The world ceased to exist, and in the end, they were taken. Many years later, a lone survivor would tell the story of that night. Sergeant Alan Crawford's journal was found by another expedition, detailing the strange events surrounding Angikuni Lake. He wrote of the lake's dark depths, the lights, and the people who vanished. His final entry was simple. They took us all. Another team, years later, would venture to the site, unaware of the history that lay beneath the ice. They found the same silence, the same eerie stillness in the air. The lake had not changed, and they would soon realize the same forces were still at play. As the second search party approached the edge of the lake, the ice shifted again. They heard a faint hum, like the sound of a distant melody that seemed to draw them in. They ventured further against all instinct as the hum grew louder and more intense. Something beneath the lake was calling to them. The lights returned, exactly as they had before, floating above the lake. The shapes grew clearer, shifting in the night, like an eerie dance in the sky. The search party froze, staring in awe and horror at the display before them. It wasn't just a phenomenon. It was a warning. They had come to claim new souls. To their horror, the village began to reappear on the horizon, just like it had in the past. The huts rose from the frozen ground, appearing solid and intact. The search party members looked at one another, unsure of what was real. The village was never gone. It was always there, waiting. As the search party ventured closer to the huts, they found the same untouched meals and empty graves. The dogs were still frozen in their places, and the air grew thicker with the weight of something watching them. It was as if the village had been stuck in time, waiting for the next victims. One of the search party members tried to leave the village, but as he turned to run, he was pulled back by an unseen force. The villagers, now twisted and ghostly, emerged from the shadows. They were no longer human, but something worse. Something ancient. Their hollow eyes fixed on the newcomer. The search party tried to fight back, but their weapons had no effect on the shadowy figures that emerged from the lake. They were surrounded, trapped in the village that never left. The ice cracked beneath them again, and as the figures reached out, they were pulled into the depths. Their screams echoed, lost to the cold, frozen waters. Months later, a new expedition would arrive. but they would never find the village. Angikuni Lake had swallowed it whole, and with it, any trace of those who had entered. The lake remained undisturbed, its surface cold and unyielding. The villagers had vanished, but they would always remain, waiting beneath the ice. To this day, no one dares to approach Angikuni Lake. The village may be gone, but the legend remains. The lights still appear, and the lake's depths are filled with the souls of the lost. No one knows the truth, but some say, if you listen closely, you can hear the whispers of those who vanished long ago.